It started out so innocently, with me wanting to build a small garden railway around the edges of my backyard, just a fun little train track to entertain my nieces and nephews when they visited and to make my otherwise boring yard feel a bit more alive. Less than an hour after I set the first section of track into the soil, Carol, our HOA president and self-appointed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, was already at my front door with a laminated copy of the community bylaws clutched in her hand like she had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. According to Carol, my miniature train setup violated at least 4 regulations before I had even finished unpacking the box, including unauthorized external structures, unapproved landscaping modifications, potential noise disturbances, and a truly absurd clause about preserving the uniformity of garden themes. I tried to explain that it was just a small train set, barely 6 inches off the ground, but Carol treated it like I was trying to build a nuclear power plant between my tomato plants. By the time I had finished setting up the first loop of track, Carol had already filed an official violation notice, demanded that the train station be dismantled immediately, and threatened escalating daily fines if I refused to comply. For a moment I actually considered giving up, but the sheer ridiculousness of the whole thing, being fined over a toy train, lit a rebellious spark inside me that I did not know I had. If the HOA was going to treat my tiny railway like a federal crime scene, then I figured I might as well give them something worth complaining about. That night, fueled by spite and a late-night internet shopping spree, I ordered over $2,000 worth of garden railway supplies, including miniature bridges, working railroad signals, a scale model train depot, and enough track to wrap my entire yard 3 times over. Within a week, my innocent garden railway had transformed into a full-blown miniature train empire, complete with multiple lines, themed stations, tiny freight yards, and even a small replica of the Maplewood HOA office building, which I placed directly next to the pretend trash dump. Every morning while my neighbors sipped their coffee, my trains rolled past their fences, pulling miniature cargo loads of fake coal, tiny crates marked HOA violation records, and even a little flatbed carrying a figurine of Carol herself, standing there clutching her miniature clipboard. The neighborhood kids loved it, spending hours watching the trains weave through tunnels and over bridges, while their parents, most of whom secretly loathed Carol, started bringing lawn chairs to my yard just to watch the whole thing in action. Carol, however, saw my train station not as a whimsical attraction but as an act of war, and she responded with all the subtlety of a bulldozer at a garden party. First came the citations, pouring in like clockwork, each more ridiculous than the last: unlawful railway construction, unapproved installation of non-standard garden ornaments, creation of an unauthorized transit hub, and my personal favorite, intentional visual disruption of community harmony. Then came the threats of legal action, warning me that my unsanctioned transit facility could trigger neighborhood-wide penalties if property values were affected. I countered by offering free train rides to every neighbor who wanted one, turning my backyard into an open community attraction where families gathered on weekends to picnic beside the tracks while children took turns being honorary conductors. Local businesses donated miniature billboards to place along the railway, turning my trains into a rolling advertising platform for everything from local pizza places to the neighborhood dog groomer. Carol tried to shut it down by claiming my backyard had become a commercial enterprise, but my lawyer, who by now had taken me on as his favorite pro bono client just for the entertainment value, pointed out that no money changed hands, making it a purely voluntary community experience. Frustrated, Carol escalated to demanding noise assessments, citing the clicking sound of the wheels on the track as a violation of the community's quiet hours policy. In response, I installed a sound system along the tracks that played soft classical music as the trains rolled by, turning my yard into a mobile garden symphony, which the neighbors absolutely adored. The more Carol tried to crush the trains, the more the neighborhood rallied around them, with residents offering to donate garden space for expansion and some even building their own complementary tracks to connect to mine, creating a patchwork neighborhood railway that spanned 3 properties. By the end of the first month, the Maplewood Miniature Railway had its own Facebook page, its own printed schedule, and a weekly train day where families from outside the neighborhood came to see the now famous backyard railroad. Carol's fury reached new heights when the local news ran a feel-good segment about my garden railway, calling it the heartwarming story of a community brought together by creativity and one man's love of trains. That same night, Carol emailed me an official cease and desist letter demanding the immediate removal of all railway-related infrastructure under threat of daily fines, forced removal, and possible litigation for what she called chronic community destabilization. I printed her letter, framed it, and hung it in my garden shed next to a photo of the first train that ever rolled down my track, because by that point I knew something Carol did not. My backyard was no longer just a hobby. It had become a symbol of everything the neighborhood loved about living here, and everything they hated about the HOA trying to control every square inch of their lives. And no matter how many citations Carol printed, no matter how many threats she shouted across my fence, the trains would keep running because once you lay tracks for a community's joy, there is no going back. Carol did not just escalate, she detonated, filing an official complaint not only with the HOA board but also with the county zoning office, the local environmental agency, and for reasons no one could fully understand, the regional transit authority. According to her, my miniature railway was not just a violation of community standards, but an unpermitted transit project that could potentially disrupt underground utilities, alter natural drainage patterns, and, in her words, pose a risk to migratory bird paths. The sheer absurdity of watching Carol argue that my garden trains were a threat to local wildlife would have been hilarious if it were not attached to a stack of legal documents taller than my mailbox. The HOA fined me daily, escalating the penalties until my official balance topped $17,000, and Carol held an emergency HOA meeting to demand a community vote to authorize a lien on my property if I refused to dismantle the railway. That meeting, however, did not go the way she expected because by then my garden railway had become the neighborhood's favorite attraction, a rare source of actual joy in a community otherwise defined by grass height regulations and mailbox inspections. Families stood up one after another to defend the railway, calling it the first thing their kids got excited about since moving in, and even a few longtime residents admitted they had started looking forward to train day more than anything else on the community calendar. Carol, sensing the room turning against her, tried to frame the railway as a dangerous precedent, warning that if I got away with it, the neighborhood would descend into chaos, with people turning their gardens into roller coasters and petting zoos. Unfortunately for her, my neighbor to the left had already started building a small carousel for his grandkids, and my neighbor to the right had recently adopted a trio of very vocal peacocks, so the whole slippery slope argument slid straight into irrelevance. The vote to approve the lien failed spectacularly, leaving Carol visibly trembling with rage, but she still had one more weapon, the lawsuit. A week later, I was officially served, with Carol personally handing me a folder of documents accusing me of violating architectural uniformity standards, running an unlicensed entertainment venue, contributing to noise pollution, damaging neighborhood aesthetics, and, most bafflingly, illegally operating a transportation service without community consent. My lawyer could barely read the complaint without laughing, but we took it seriously, knowing that Carol would pour every ounce of her energy into dragging me through court if it meant finally derailing my trains. What she did not anticipate was how much attention the lawsuit would draw. By this point, the story of my garden railway and Carol's war against it had spread beyond Maplewood, landing in local papers, online blogs, and eventually a few quirky news segments on channels known for covering small-town absurdity. Reporters came to interview me while the trains chugged along behind me, kids waving at the cameras, and the whole thing turned into a minor tourist attraction with visitors from nearby towns stopping by just to see the infamous railway that had shattered an HOA's grip on power. The court case itself became a circus, with neighbors showing up to every hearing wearing homemade conductor hats and carrying signs reading "Let the trains roll" and "Carol hates fun." Carol's lawyer tried to argue that the trains violated the HOA's authority to maintain aesthetic harmony, but my lawyer countered with pages of community testimonials, letters from local businesses praising the foot traffic the railway had brought to the area, and a signed statement from the county's own cultural preservation officer calling the railway a valuable example of folk art and community-driven placemaking. Carol's case fell apart further when her own witnesses, recruited from her dwindling pool of HOA loyalists, admitted under cross-examination that they had secretly taken their grandkids to ride the trains despite complaining about them in public. The judge, clearly tired of the entire affair, urged us to settle, but I refused to dismantle even a single inch of track, knowing that giving Carol even the smallest victory would only invite more ridiculous battles in the future. Ultimately, the court ruled that the trains could stay, provided they did not generate commercial revenue or block access to neighboring properties, neither of which had ever happened in the first place. Carol's defeat would have been satisfying enough, but what followed was even better. The judge's written ruling officially referred to my garden railway as a community cultural asset, a designation that not only protected it from future HOA interference but also qualified it for small grant funding under the county's cultural development program. Overnight, my backyard went from neighborhood nuisance to officially recognized landmark, complete with a historical plaque provided by the county's historical society, which described the railway as an example of creative suburban placemaking in defiance of restrictive governance. Carol's reaction was priceless, her face locked in a grimace of disbelief as the plaque was installed right next to the front gate, ensuring her morning power walks would forever pass by a public monument to her failure. By the time the case ended, the trains had become far more than a backyard hobby. They were a living monument to the power of community creativity, an accidental act of rebellion that turned into a symbol of what happens when people refuse to let their joy be legislated out of existence. Carol had tried to crush a toy train, and instead she had built me a legend, one that rolled forward every single day along tracks that no amount of bylaws could ever cover. Carol's defeat in court should have been the end of it, but if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she thrived on control the way plants needed sunlight, and the humiliation of losing to a garden railway had planted something dark and twisted in her soul. Instead of retreating gracefully, Carol launched what could only be described as a full-scale psychological warfare campaign, dedicated not just to destroying my trains, but to punishing the entire neighborhood for siding with me. She started by sending out an HOA newsletter titled The Cost of Chaos, warning homeowners that my railway had opened the floodgates for unchecked anarchy, and predicting that within months, Maplewood would be overrun with flamingo lawns, inflatable pools, and unsanctioned wind chimes. When that did not land the way she hoped, she took her campaign offline, walking door to door handing out printed flyers with grainy photos of my trains taken from behind her curtains, complete with captions like "This is how neighborhoods die and is your property value next." Most neighbors either laughed or added the flyers to their refrigerators like collectible Carol memorabilia, but a few, mostly the elderly residents who had been terrified of HOA wrath for decades, started to worry that Carol might have one last trick up her sleeve. And she did. One morning, I woke up to find my garden railway surrounded by caution tape, with laminated signs posted at each corner reading "Pending Environmental Review," with Carol herself pacing up and down the sidewalk, pretending to talk on the phone with a government agency that almost certainly had no idea she existed. Her latest scheme involved filing an anonymous complaint with the local environmental office, claiming that my trains were leaking oil, disturbing soil quality, and possibly releasing unsafe levels of diesel fumes, despite the fact that my trains were entirely electric and ran on rechargeable batteries. When the actual environmental inspector showed up and found nothing but spotless tracks, happy families, and a perfectly maintained garden, he left with a brochure for train day and a free lemonade, telling Carol politely that she was wasting everyone's time. That should have been the end, but Carol had descended too far into obsession to stop, and within days she was sending complaints to the fire department claiming my tracks created an unsafe evacuation route, to animal control claiming the trains were distressing local wildlife, and even to the post office claiming the trains interfered with mail delivery. Each agency arrived, each agency laughed, and each agency left, many of them sticking around long enough to take pictures and grab a ride on the miniature passenger train that now carried neighborhood kids in laps around the yard. Carol's frustration boiled over into public view, culminating in a spectacular meltdown during the next HOA meeting, where she stood in front of the entire neighborhood and screamed that the trains were a symbol of moral decay, proof that Maplewood had lost its way, and that allowing them to continue would unravel the very fabric of suburban life. That speech, unfortunately for her, was recorded and uploaded to the Maplewood Neighborhood Facebook page, where it quickly racked up thousands of views and inspired an avalanche of memes, from photoshopped movie posters titled "Trainspotting 2", Carol's revenge to a fake change.org petition demanding Carol be replaced with a train whistle as HOA president. By this point, Carol had become her own worst enemy, her relentless obsession turning her from a feared authority figure into the neighborhood's punchline, and with each passing day fewer people took her seriously. Desperate for one final power move, Carol attempted to gather signatures for a new emergency bylaw, the Comprehensive Decorative Train Prohibition Act, which would ban all garden trains, toy railways, and any outdoor structures containing rails, regardless of size. She needed 75 signatures to force a community vote, but after 2 weeks of knocking on doors, she had gathered exactly 5, 3 of which were from her own family and 1 from a homeowner who later admitted they thought they were signing up for a train ride reservation. Meanwhile, the railway continued to grow not just in my yard but throughout the neighborhood, with several families adding their own tracks, linking our properties into a fully connected miniature transit system that became known as the Maplewood Express. By the time fall arrived, Train Day had evolved into a full-blown neighborhood festival, complete with themed rides, track decorating contests, and even a Halloween ghost train where the kids wore costumes and the parents set up spooky scenes along the route. Carol's defeat was no longer just legal, it was cultural, with the trains becoming the beating heart of neighborhood life while she stood on the sidelines, ignored and irrelevant. Her desperation reached its peak when she tried to personally dismantle part of the track in the dead of night, only to trip over a gnome and fall directly into the pond my neighbor had installed next to our shared railway junction. Soaked, muddy, and caught on multiple security cameras, Carol became an overnight legend not just in Maplewood, but in the broader world of HOA horror stories, with the footage even making its way onto a national morning show under the title The Train That Broke the HOA. Defeated at every turn, Carol finally resigned from the HOA entirely, claiming that Maplewood was no longer worth saving, and that she refused to preside over what she called a theme park masquerading as a neighborhood. Her resignation letter, which was mysteriously leaked to the neighborhood Facebook page within minutes, became the final rallying cry for the railway supporters, who held one last farewell party in her honor, the Carol's Farewell Express, complete with a life-size cardboard cutout of her placed at the train depot, clipboard in hand. Carol moved out less than a month later, selling her house for a loss just to escape the very community she had tried so hard to control, while the Maplewood Express rolled on without her, a permanent reminder that neighborhoods belong to the people who live in them, not the people who want to rule them. Even after her departure, her legacy lived on, with new homeowners being welcomed not with boring HOA pamphlets, but with complimentary train tickets and a guided tour of the now legendary tracks. The trains had started as my personal hobby, but thanks to Carol they became something far bigger. A monument to defiance, community, and the unstoppable power of a neighborhood that just wanted to have fun. With Carol gone and her reign of terror officially over, the Maplewood Express entered its golden age, expanding from a quirky backyard attraction into a fully integrated neighborhood tradition that no HOA would ever dare to challenge again. What started as a petty act of rebellion had become the pulse of the entire community, a shared piece of pride that every homeowner felt a little ownership over, even the ones who had initially grumbled about noise and property values. The tracks stretched further than I ever imagined, winding through neighboring yards, over garden ponds, past flower beds and patios, creating a miniature rail network that linked homes not just physically but socially. People who had lived side by side for years without exchanging more than polite nods became conductors, station masters and maintenance crews, all united by a sense of playful defiance and creative freedom. My backyard no longer felt like mine alone. It felt like everyone's, a communal canvas where new ideas popped up every week, from holiday-themed train cars to pop-up art installations placed along the route. The HOA, now under new leadership and desperate to rebuild trust, officially designated the railway as a protected cultural feature, enshrining it into the community charter to ensure no future Carol could ever dream of tearing it down. The first thing the new HOA president did after being elected was host her swearing-in ceremony aboard the Maplewood Express, holding her hand on a copy of the original railway map instead of the bylaws. The story of the trains spread beyond Maplewood, inspiring other neighborhoods trapped under the thumb of controlling HOAs to start their own creative rebellions, turning gardens into miniature theme parks, pop-up libraries, and even community theaters. I started receiving letters from across the country, fellow homeowners asking for advice on how to outweed their own carols, how to use bylaws against the very people who wrote them, and how to turn petty citations into community movements. What I realized, standing beside the tracks one afternoon while a newly painted train rolled by carrying a dozen laughing kids, was that this was never really about trains at all. It was about ownership, not of land or property, but of the right to shape our own lives, to decide for ourselves what community should look like, free from the grip of people who mistake control for leadership. The Maplewood Express became a living reminder of that lesson, a rolling monument to the power of ordinary people choosing joy over fear, creativity over control, and laughter over laminated rules. The tracks became a timeline of our neighborhood story, each twist and turn a reminder of a battle fought and won. The noise complaints, the environmental review, the lawsuit, and of course Carol's final soggy retreat into obscurity. Over time, the trains evolved, as they always had, growing alongside the community itself. New residents added their own touches, turning sections of track into memorial gardens, community herb patches, even tiny roadside attractions like a model lemonade stand run by figurines of the kids who had once sold real lemonade there. Every year, on the anniversary of the first train day, the whole neighborhood gathered for a festival unlike anything you would expect in a quiet suburban development. Bands played, food trucks lined the street, and the trains ran nonstop from morning to night, their little wheels carrying not just passengers, but memories, jokes, and all the tiny victories that had led us here. The festival always ended the same way, with a ceremonial first run by the Carol commemorative caboose, a bright orange train car painted with quotes from her most absurd emails, dragged slowly along the tracks to the sound of the entire neighborhood applauding. People moved to Maplewood specifically because they had heard about the railway, choosing our community not for its property values or its school ratings, but because they wanted to live somewhere with stories, somewhere that had fought for its own soul and won. As for me, I eventually retired from my role as chief engineer, passing the conductor's hat to the next generation of creative troublemakers, but I never left the tracks entirely. Every evening, I walked the perimeter of the garden, inspecting the rails, watering the plants, waving to passing trains like an old station master who could not quite bring himself to leave the platform. The trains had given me more than I ever expected. A sense of purpose, a community I actually felt part of, and a story that would outlive me by decades. In the end, Carol's legacy was exactly the opposite of what she had wanted. She set out to preserve order and control, and instead she accidentally gave birth to a community bound together by chaos, creativity, and the unshakable belief that life is better when you can build a train in your own backyard. Years later, when the local historical society placed an official marker beside the tracks, it read more like a fairy tale than a neighborhood history. It told the story of one stubborn man, a plastic train, and a neighborhood that decided to take back its joy 1 inch of track at a time. I stood there the day they unveiled the marker, shaking hands with neighbors old and new, and I realized that even though the trains were small, they had carried something enormous, the weight of freedom itself, carried on tiny rails past tiny stations all the way into legend.